U.S. President Donald Trump signed a defense bill of more than $700 billion on Monday.
And next year, already approved, we have $716 billion to give you the finest planes and ships and tanks and missiles.
Focusing more on what the White House calls great power competition, aiming specifically at China and Russia. While slapping tariffs on multiple countries on the other hand, is the U.S. starting a new Cold War? Trump has launched a trade war against many other countries in the name of defending the profit of U.S. enterprises. But different voices have been heard on the actions he has taken. Is Donald Trump really standing for the interests of the U.S. business community? The next round of tariffs on $16 billion of Chinese goods will take effect on the 23rd of this month, as the China-U.S. trade dispute shows no signs of slowing down. Other than the commercial demands, what is the driving force behind the ongoing trade war? One of the major disputes regarding trade is China's performance after entering the WTO. The U.S. side believes China hasn't worked enough on opening its market access as the other nations expected. What exactly is China's track record in the WTO?
Hi there. The U.S. launched a second tranche of tariffs imposed on Chinese goods, adding fuel to the ever-expanding trade battle between China and the U.S. China-U.S. relations have reached a pivotal turning point. In the long run, how do trade and economic policies adopted by each country reflect its stance on global governance? Will Trump's moves that aim to hamper China's rise backfire on him? Are third-party countries catalysts or casualties in the game between the two biggest economies? To discuss these questions and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Chen Dawei, who is a research fellow at the National Academy of Development and Strategy and a professor with the School of Economics at the Renmin University of China, Professor Robert Rogovsky, who is a professor of the International Trade and Economic Diplomacy program at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, and Andy Mock, who is the managing director at Red Pagoda Resources. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue. Now, the U.S. will impose a 25% tariffs on $16 billion worth of Chinese goods starting August 23rd. What does he want? Does he aim to kill the Chinese economy or keep China trailing behind the United States by at least 2 decades? What do you think is what he and his team really want?
Oh, I don't think the president really wants to kill the Chinese economy or slow it down. What I think the U.S. administration wants is for China to become a more open economy and to allow greater access of American investment into China and investment into China without restrictions on that investment, without requirements for technology transfer. I think the United States has long wanted China to have a more rigorous intellectual property protection system. So I think what the administration is really looking for is to get China to be a more open and free economy for American investment, American trade.
So, Professor Chen, basically the Trump administration fundamentally disagrees with the way the Chinese government engineers its economic development. For example, state-sponsored SOE, state-run enterprises, the vision of 2025. In a word, these two countries are in entirely different lanes of industrial policies, right?
Yeah, I think from Chinese perspective, as a scholar, I think I hear different kind of voice. From President Trump, I often heard about trade imbalance, trade deficit. But from USTR, from their report, 301 report, they talk about China industrial policy and China's intellectual property issues is another issue. And from some scholars, they even talk about political issues. So for me, it's kind of very clear what's the U.S. wants. What's the final destination they want to reach,
It is clear. So what is it?
I think they want, like Professor Rogovsky said, they finally want China more opening up, yeah.
In which area? Andy, in what areas do you think the Chinese economy fails to be open enough?
Well, I think, China still is a developing economy, and some of the systems are being perfected. But I think we need to take a step back here and also look at this, that there's two levels to understand this problem. I think Professor Mikowski is absolutely right from a trade and investment perspective that the U.S. wants China to be more open, to stop some of these practices that the U.S. finds objectionable. But I think if we look a bigger picture from a geopolitical perspective, I think there is a deeper problem here, or a deeper challenge that is being worked out. And that is, so from my time at RAND back in the 90s, even before then, I think that the U.S.'s geopolitical goal is to not tolerate any challenges to quote-unquote American leadership, which is economic, technological, and military superiority. So I think this is actually much more than just about solving a trade, investment, and market access issue, and that perhaps is an even more difficult challenge to address than market access.
Therefore, what we see in the trade standoff between the two biggest economies could only be viewed as the tip of the huge iceberg. So trade is not the issue. David, do you agree?
I do not totally agree. I do think trade is an issue at the beginning stage. I think
it is an issue, but not the most important issue.
Not the only
the bilateral
not
relationship.
the only issue, yeah. But from long run, maybe we'll cover a lot of issues.
It seems the United States has been left quite disillusioned with China's rapid development and global expansion, particularly under the Chinese communist leadership. And therefore, when the Chinese authorities believe, even if we have made serious concessions in the trade friction, the United States wants China to fall apart, to demise, to really cease to exist as a serious challenger. Then the Chinese and the Chinese government would give a second thought. Why should I make any concessions if you want me to be dead?
Wow. Well, this does open us up to a whole range of topics in the iceberg below the surface. But you raise a really good point, and that is, with the end of history, it was popular in America to think that the logic of most modernizing industries and societies would be towards a liberal democracy. Mm-hmm. And the advent of China into the WTO was in many ways a belief, an optimism, that when China entered the WTO, it would also encourage China to continue on a path towards a more democratic system, mm-hmm. and a more open and free trading international economic system. So a capitalism a bit like America's. And the idea for allowing China in and encouraging it to come into the WTO was with that path in mind. It has, and there was a great optimism about this for many years, but it is true that American business in particular seems to be sensing that the movement towards a liberal democracy and a free and open capitalist system is not progressing as fast as it was before. So the regulatory reforms that we had hoped to see, that had been negotiated as access to the WTO, and that people were seeing, and we would see in experiments in China like the Shanghai Pilot Free Trade Zone and other free trade zones, was experimentation with reforms that people in the United States, particularly the business community, was very enthusiastic about. That seems to be slowing down. There seems to be a chilling of that movement, and a sense among American business that they're not quite as welcome in China, that sense of participation and openness to American and foreign business is not as great as it was. So part of what we're seeing now is a reaction to the idea that we need to continue to push China in that direction, not to end China, not to limit China or its growth, but to have China continue to move towards a more open and free capitalist system, which is something our businessmen are more comfortable with and more used to and feel like they can compete more effectively in.
I would maybe push back a little bit on that, in that I would think most corporate CEOs are at best neutral on China's political system. I mean, of course, they have to engage in the rhetoric as American companies that they believe in democracy, human rights, and all this. But I think at the end of the day, they care about making money. And I think what has disillusioned a lot of American companies here is that it's no longer as easy because China's economy has advanced. Its own companies have become globally competitive. And that, I think, has put them off as much, if not more, than the movement of China towards becoming a liberal democracy.
Yeah, I agree.
And let me just jump in, because I agree with that, and I don't mean to imply that American business is interested in China becoming a liberal democracy, but I do think they are interested in China having a capitalist system or a market system in which they can operate as freely and as competitively as they can in the U.S. system. So I don't think they feel that. I do agree that there's been an awful lot of advances in China, a lot of reforms, and a lot of progress being made, but I do think that American businesses feel like they're not as free to operate in the Chinese market as they felt like they were before or would like to be.
I'd like to know more about how AmCham responds to the Trump administration's latest round of trade warfare. Now, when the Chinese side or the AmCham itself conducts a survey among the members of this organization, it seems most of the AmCham members can accept the market for technology transfer. They can accept the idea of joint venture. However, the Trump administration says this is against the American political will or against the principles of American business community. So which one is true? Which is closer to the picture of truth?
I think I read some survey. I think the former one is true. I read some, I met some business people in operating business in China, and most of them are satisfied with China's business environment. I think compared to 20 years ago, our business environment is improving. I think also through WTO membership, we did a lot of reform, and we built a law system. We are doing well. So maybe we have some problem, but we can resolve the problem in the future through negotiation, I think.
Then the next issue is whether China has violated seriously intellectual property rights. You are watching Dialogue with Professor Robert Rogowski, Professor Chen Dawei, and Mr. Andy Mock. We are discussing the current trade standoff between the United States and China, as well as general bilateral relationship. As a result, stay with us. We'll be back. Welcome back. So when the business community of the United States says we'll no longer defend the U.S.-China relationship, does that indicate the beginning of a major crisis that will lead to serious deterioration of the bilateral relationship, the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world, Andy?
Well, I think, once upon a time in the United States, it was said that the business of America is business. What's good for GM is good for the country. So I think while that's still true, that business is very important, it creates jobs, it creates tax revenue, economic development, but I think there's more to this relationship than just the business part, and corporate America losing some enthusiasm for China. I think one of the more important issues is, we've been here before, Professor Rogowski, we were talking about that this happened with Japan back in the 80s. It happened even again before that, because when we look back to the 1800s, the United States passed the Chinese Exclusion Act because they were afraid of Chinese workers coming over, working too hard, taking jobs away from white Americans. So I think this is also, while this is new, these tensions with China, This latest manifestation is new, but I think it's also a structural issue with the United States as well, and that's important to recognize.
We have to do some case study, Robert. For example, what do you make of the latest moves by the automaker Musk to relocate its major manufacturing center to Shanghai? How do you look at the mindset of the American business community? Have they decided to give up the Chinese market?
Oh, I think quite the contrary. I think American business is extremely interested in participating in the Chinese economy. Truly, for a company to be a world-class player, it has to be active in the Chinese market. It's just too big not to be. And I think that American business is very enthusiastic about China. Frankly, American business is very enthusiastic about China growing rapidly, even faster, and moving up the economic chain, because then it becomes an even better customer for what America actually produces. So I think that in the business community, there's not any sense that there's a frustration or anger at the Chinese economy. I think there's a tremendous support for the Chinese
Given
economy.
the growing importance of the huge army of middle-class consumers in the Chinese market, and the importance of a global industrial chain in the age of globalization, is it a feasible option for the Trump administration, and indeed for the two parties across the aisle in the Congress, to reach a consensus that China must be bashed and must be kept trailing behind the United States for at least 2 decades?
I think, as you mentioned, China has 2 advantages at least. One is the market power. We have so many populations. Yeah, the sizes matter. Also, we have global value chain advantage. We can make nearly everything. Everything can be made in China, and also we can supply a major part for American. Something made in America. So, due to this advantage, no government can say no to China, but it is better to find a right way to discuss how to use the
Is it possible, therefore, a
market.
question for 3 of you, is it possible for China to find an alternative market if the United States decides to phase out its business stakes from the Chinese market? Very quickly, Robert, what's your take?
Well, I think if they have to find alternative markets, they will find alternative markets, just like the United States.
But the issue is the costs.
It will.
How expensive?
It'll be very costly. It's a terrible thing to contemplate, because yes, it's possible, but it would be an extremely costly measure and a great loss to global welfare to try to break the chains, the global value chains that now exist between the United States and China.
And Dawi?
It's possible.
It is possible. In the European Union, Africa, Latin America, or Southeast Asia,
the rest of
all
the
of them
world,
combined together.
Yeah.
But what about the opportunity costs, Andy?
Well, there's certainly opportunity cost. If you have a background in economics, you know that the reason why trade is good is that it allows countries to specialize and everyone is better off. So, but on the other hand, I think it's not just possible, but probably likely that we will see this separation between the United States and China, because we could see now it's not just the trade war, but now concerns about investment, about the presence of Chinese students in the United States. So I think it's not too hard to imagine this parallel system evolving where the U.S. isolates itself under Trump's vision of economic nationalism, but that China still continues to grow, continues to integrate with the world through the Belt and Road Initiative, through a lot of other global governance policies that it's pushing to continue making the world a multilateral marketplace.
From the American perspective, they accuse China of trying to discredit American democracy, seeking to dismantle the U.S.-led world order and to seek a change of the American world leadership. Well, for these critically important 3 areas, China is coming under heavy fire, and therefore, given the global context of power shift from the west to the east, the United States feels extremely upset, and therefore the theory of Thucydides' trap Do you agree fundamentally we'll be on the collision course? Do you agree? This is a tough question.
It is a tough question, and I'm trying to think about how to answer it in less than an hour. The U.S. and China are clearly not on a collision course. They've collided. We have collided for the last 10 years at least, and we're working through the collision already.
In Chinese, you know, it's called 斗而不破. We have fightings, but not a war, comprehensive war, and not a total separation or total deterioration of the relationship.
Well, a good term then, because we have a collision, we will have conflict, and we will have a convergence eventually, hopefully without the all too often result of the Thucydides trap, and that is a war. And I don't think we're going to have a war. I think we're going to be able to work this through. But it is a collision, and it is a collision of a hegemonic country making space now for a second large hegemonic country, a new great power working its way into the system. That's the Thucydides trap, which all too often in history has ended up in war. But fortunately, I believe, and I'm very optimistic, that we're going to be able to work through this. But the working through it will have a great deal of friction.
Now, the United States seems to be ready to challenge our Belt and Road Initiative. Let's look at something different. The latest move by approving the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act. The United States wants to limit the influence of Confucius schools in the United States. We have more than 100 such schools in the United States, and they forbid the United States armed forces from using Huawei smartphones. They prevent Confucius schools of spreading its influence of Chinese values in particular. Now, what can you tell us about the two policy moves by the Trump administration?
I don't know exactly what Trump administration did, but I know they are not so satisfied with Confucius schools. But what I'm going to say, China don't want to, withdraw from current multilateral system. China always say we respect the U.S. leadership, we respect, the multilateral system. That is true. But China has their own culture. They want to deliver China's culture, China's voice to the world. Also, is reasonable. So it's kind of, through culture exchange, we can better understand each other.
Do you think this policy ban on the teachings of Confucius schools in the United States in particular is a result of American exceptionalism? And what does American exceptionalism actually means for the rest of the world? Does it mean religious crusade? The United States is the only country that can dictate the world on its terms, or what?
Well, I think exceptionalism normally has a positive connotation. Here, I think part of the issue actually stems from American insecurity, because when you look at how children are taught in the United States, it's about these ideas of making the world safe for democracy. We have to evangelize so everyone becomes like us, otherwise we can't live in peace. And in a way, it's kind of an immature attitude, because when you think about children, one of the most important life lessons is learning how to get along with people that are different than you. So we think about it applied to countries. It's unfortunate, I think, that the U.S. has in this way a somewhat
the issue,
exceptional
I'm
view.
afraid, Davi and the other two gentlemen, the issue is that China shares much of the same belief. 非我族类，其心必异. If you are not one of us, you will be hostile. You are the enemy.
Somehow the Western people has this kind of thinking, philosophy, either white or black. Do not like China. We find something in the middle way, but I don't think all Americans think this way, right? I feel
no
we are
compromise
still friends.
To be made. Is that the American reckoning? Yeah. There's no margin for any maneuvers except you accept the terms, our terms, except you surrender. unconditionally. Will that be an agreement to be reached on the deck of the warship at the end of the Second World War between the United States and Japan? I mean, Missouri, the warship. I mean, that's something very serious. I mean.
Yeah, and I think that was appropriate in that situation. But I don't think it's appropriate, and I don't think it will be expected in a trade war. I think that what we're looking for is compromise. And I will say that Professor Cheng is absolutely right. We're not monolithic in the United States. We are an incredibly diverse group and disagree about everything.
But China bashing seems to be the only consensus that all elements of the society, all forces of the society can build.
But I think it's important to make this distinction, though. I think you're absolutely right about the people of the United States. But I think here we're talking about the government. And I think the government has, of course, there's different voices, right?
Yeah.
But we've heard so many extreme voices coming out of the Trump administration. What about the moderate think tanks like Brookings, Rand, and Carnegie? What are they talking about? Their voices seem to have been dismissed completely.
Well, I'm going to jump in with both of my colleagues here, because if you look at the opinions in the United States and what scholars are writing, what people in think tanks are writing, and what the bulk of the American government has been doing, it has been developing a trade regime that is inclusive and flexible and creative and compromising. And that is what the WTO is supposed to be creating, and this is something that we have been very, very supportive of. So if you go into Washington and ask about relationships with China, it's a very positive response. This is not about bashing China. It's not about stopping China. It's about working well with China and avoiding the conflict, avoiding the collusions, avoiding the Thucydides trap, and working effectively and cooperatively and commercially with China. A large, large body of thinking in Washington and in the government below the high level, the high decibel sounds that you often hear is extremely constructive.
Well, with that being said, I mean, but I think it matters, though, what the government's stance is. And we look at the national defense strategy. Now it's moved away from terrorism as the main threat, but great power rivalry. And I think while these are seemingly dry documents, I think they have incredibly important repercussions, you know, in things like defense spending, messaging, policy decisions at the State Department,
in one of the presidential debates, President Obama seemed to be saying, unless China follows the rules, Beijing will be our adversary. That seems to be pointing to the fundamental principle of who will write the rules and who should follow unconditionally the rules set forth by the United States. It seems WTO itself has become a problem instead of a solution. Is the United States ready to rebuild the world order, rebuild the rules on their own terms? I don't know, but we're going to continue to discuss on this program, Dialogue. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.